Tips and tricks number 14, graph grids and detect asymptotes. These last three tips and tricks only apply to the color CE calculator. Okay, so make sure you're aware of that. So this is, again, graph grids and detect asymptotes. All right, so let's turn on the calculator and let's look at the second zoom, which is format. And go to the bottom and there's a thing called Detect Asymptotes. Right now, if it's on, leave it on. If it's not, press Enter on on. So we would like that to be on. Detect Asymptotes for right now. I want to show you what that is. So let's go to y equals and clear everything out and just go with y equals x. And we'll do a zoom 6, a zoom standard on y equals x. Okay. Now, that might have been a little slow, and the reason for that is we have Detect Asymptotes on. Let's go back to second zoom, press the up arrow, and go over to off. Press Enter. And now press Graph, and you'll notice it was much faster. So the reason for that is Detect Asymptotes Off versus On is teachers had suggested to TI that they did not like it when the calculator graphed asymptotes and they didn't want it because they hadn't talked about it yet. And the reason why it did that, it was when a graph went from like negative infinity to positive infinity, it was trying to connect those two and made an asymptote. So if this is on, every time it goes to plot a point, it's going to check to see if it's an asymptote. If it is, it won't do it, which means it takes time and it's much slower. So if you have a color calculator, my first suggestion is if you don't care, detect asymptotes off so that your graphing calculator goes faster. Detect asymptotes off. Okay. All right, the other thing is if you look at this graph here, there's something wrong with this graph. It's always been like this on TI calculators, and that is this is not a 45-degree angle. Y equals x should be 45 degrees, and the reason it isn't is it's wider than it is taller, and the units along the x-axis are not the same size as the y-axis, so it's not square. So we can get around that by doing zoom square, which is zoom number 5. And you can see those are much better, okay? And the reason we want to do that is we're going to put a grid on this. And with the color one, you can put on a grid, and I highly recommend that you do that. So again, let me go back to zoom 6. And let's go ahead and put on the grid. And that is under mode. No, it's not. It's under, sorry, second zoom. I always get format and mode mixed up. Not always, but often. So go down to grid off, make a right turn, and go to grid line. Again, this is under second zoom, which is format. You want grid line, press enter. And now it's going to put grid lines on your graph. And now when I press graph, you can see I got the grid lines, but they're rectangles, not squares. So again, I'm going to go back to zoom square. And now nice squares, okay? Very, very nicely done. So pull that off so we can see how nice that is. And the window that does that is this one. And it looks like if you disregard this tiny decimal here, if it's negative 16 to 16 and negative 10 to 10, if the window is in a ratio or proportion of 16 to 10 or 8 to 5, then it should be squared. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these in half to make these not so small. So I'm going to go negative 8 to 8, steps of 1. Y's will go from negative 5 to 5 because that would be half of the 10. And let's see if that looks pretty much square. And I think you'll agree that it is. But that window is half of what we had before without that little decimal. So these are too small, these are too big. I'm going to go halfway between these. So I'm thinking halfway between 8 and 16 is 12. So how about if we go negative 12 to 12 in steps of 1, and halfway between 5 and 10, don't ask your students because they'll say, oh no, you've gone too far, would be negative 7.5 to 7.5. Let me pull that off there, show you what that's going to look like. And press graph. And I really like that graph. The squares aren't too big, they're not too small. So this is my favorite one, so I'm going to store that as my favorite graph, favorite window. And recall the way we do that is we go to zoom, over to memory, and do number 2, zoom store. Zoom store is how you store your favorite window. And that'll replace any window I had before. So that's like my favorite window there, right there. So I can have grids, I can have my favorite window. I want my Detect Asymptotes off. Go ahead and play around with that if you want.